Imagine you are arriving in an African village more than 100 years ago. After weeks of traveling across forests, rivers, and dusty footpaths, you finally reach a thriving community. Children run between thatched homes. Somewhere in the village is a special hut. Every so often, only women quietly walk toward it. They stay there for a time, then they return home. No one explains why. You are curious. You ask a few questions, but the answers are vague. The people speak a language you barely understand. The women do not speak with you directly. Cultural boundaries prevent you from entering the building, and no one is willing to describe in detail what happens inside. So you do what every traveler does when faced with uncertainty. You make an assumption. Later that evening, you open your notebook and write a single sentence. The women are isolated because they are considered unclean. That notebook eventually finds its way into government archives. Another researcher reads it. A textbook quotes it. A documentary repeats it. More than a century later, millions of people believe they know exactly what happened inside that small building. But there is one problem. Almost none of those later writers ever asked the women themselves. History has a curious habit of becoming simpler every time it is retold. And somewhere between the original event and the modern history book, an entire world of meaning quietly disappears. Few subjects illustrate this better than the so-called moon huts that appear in discussions about menstruation across different parts of Africa and beyond. For decades, these structures have been described in two completely different ways. One version portrays them as symbols of cruelty, places where women were banished because they were feared or considered impure. The other presents them as peaceful sanctuaries where women gathered in perfect harmony, free from work and surrounded by sisterhood. The strange thing is that neither story tells the whole truth. Reality is far more interesting. To understand why, we need to begin with an uncomfortable fact about history itself. The people who first documented many African societies were not neutral observers, nor were they necessarily dishonest. They were simply human. Every observer carries invisible assumptions, shaped by their own culture. A person raised beside the sea notices different things from someone raised in a desert. An architect sees buildings differently from an economist. A doctor notices symptoms that a poet might overlook. In exactly the same way, 19th century missionaries, colonial officials, and early anthropologists viewed Africa through the lens of the societies that had shaped them. Most were men. Many came from deeply conservative Victorian cultures where public discussion of sexuality and reproduction was considered improper. Few spoke local languages fluently when they first arrived. Even fewer were allowed to enter spaces reserved exclusively for women. Those limitations mattered. Imagine trying to understand the inner workings of a hospital after being allowed to stand only in the parking lot. You would see people entering and leaving. You would notice ambulances. Perhaps you would hear fragments of conversation. But you would never witness the operations taking place inside. Any conclusions you reached would be incomplete. Something remarkably similar happened throughout the early ethnographic record. When European observers encountered customs surrounding menstruation, they often described only what they could see from the outside. Women entered a separate structure. Women remained there for a period of time. Women returned. Everything in between was frequently filtered through interpreters, assumptions, or second-hand explanations. This does not mean every early account was wrong. Far from it. Many colonial-era linguists and anthropologists preserved invaluable records of languages, oral traditions, and customs that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Without some of their painstaking documentation, historians today would know far less about many African societies. But preservation and interpretation are not the same thing. Someone can faithfully record that a building existed while completely misunderstanding why it existed. That distinction changes everything. As modern historians have revisited original field notes, oral histories, archaeological evidence, and later ethnographic research, a far more complicated picture has begun to emerge. Across Africa, there was never one universal institution called a moon hut. The phrase itself is largely a modern label. Different communities developed different customs, different beliefs, different architectural designs, different expectations. Some practices emphasized privacy, others focused on ritual. Some reflected genuine concern for health or social order. Others imposed restrictions that limited women's freedom. To speak about all of them as though they were identical would be like describing every place of worship on earth as exactly the same, simply because they are buildings used for religion. The similarities exist, so do the differences, and those differences matter. Consider this for a moment. If a historian from another planet visited Earth thousands of years from now and discovered hospitals, monasteries, boarding schools, hotels, and prisons, all containing rows of beds, they might conclude these buildings served the same purpose. They would be wrong. The architecture might appear similar. The human experience inside each building would be completely different. The same caution applies when we examine structures associated with menstrual seclusion. A small hut tells us almost nothing by itself. Its meaning comes from the people who used it. Who entered? For how long? Voluntarily or by obligation? Were they cared for? Were they isolated? Were they protected? Or were they controlled? Those questions cannot be answered simply by looking at the building. They can only be answered by understanding the community that built it. And when we begin asking those questions, one of the most famous examples in Africa immediately comes into view. High above the plains of Mali, among dramatic sandstone cliffs that have sheltered generations of people, stands a society whose architecture has fascinated scholars for more than a century. The Dogon. Their villages would become some of the most photographed traditional settlements in Africa. And among their many remarkable buildings was one small structure that would become central to one of anthropology's most enduring debates. The question was never whether the building existed. The real question was what it meant. The Dogon people have fascinated researchers for generations, living along the dramatic Bandiagara escarpment in present-day Mali. They built villages that seemed to emerge from the cliffs themselves. Stone houses cling to the rock face. Ancient granaries stand above the valley floor. Every structure appears deliberate, as though the landscape and the community were designed together. Among these buildings is one that has generated more debate than almost any other. A small circular structure that many researchers identify as a menstrual hut. The Dogon call it the Punulu, although spellings vary between ethnographic sources because different researchers recorded the local language differently over the past century. For decades, photographs of these buildings appeared in anthropology textbooks around the world. Yet one simple question divided researchers. Was this building a prison? Or was it something entirely different? The answer depends on which evidence you choose to read. Some early observers saw only separation. Women entered the structure during menstruation. Therefore, they concluded the women must have been excluded because they were considered impure. It was a straightforward conclusion, perhaps too straightforward. Later anthropologists who spent far longer living among the Dogon began describing a much more complex reality. Rather than relying solely on brief observations, they learned the language, participated in daily village life, and most importantly, spoke directly with Dogon women whenever cultural customs allowed. What they discovered challenged many earlier assumptions. The structure was certainly associated with menstrual seclusion. That much is well documented. But its purpose could not be reduced to a single explanation. For some women, it offered privacy in communities where large extended families often shared limited living space. For others, it provided temporary relief from the relentless rhythm of domestic responsibilities. Cooking, fetching water, grinding grain, preparing meals, caring for children. These were physically demanding tasks repeated day after day. Stepping away from those responsibilities, even briefly, could represent something entirely different from punishment. It could represent rest. Some ethnographic accounts describe food being brought to women during this period. Others record conversations between younger and older women, where knowledge about marriage, childbirth, and reproductive health was shared away from the constant demands of everyday work. But here's where we must resist the temptation to replace one myth with another. Not every woman experienced the Pernulu in the same way. Communities changed over time. Practices different from village to village. Personal experiences varied according to age, family circumstances, and local customs. History rarely gives us unanimous voices. Instead, it gives us many voices speaking at once. Some describe comfort, others describe obligation. Both deserve to be heard. This is one of the greatest challenges in studying the past. Modern audiences often demand simple answers. Was the practice good, or was it bad? History usually refuses to cooperate. The truth is often both more complicated and more human. The Dogon example teaches us an important lesson. Buildings do not possess meaning on their own. People give them meaning. A hospital can save lives. It can also be a place where people experience fear and grief. A school can inspire curiosity. It can also be remembered as a place of hardship. The same building can hold completely different memories depending on the person telling the story. It reminds us that architecture is never just about walls and roofs. It reflects the values of the society that built it. Sometimes those values protected people. Sometimes they restricted them. Often they did both at the same time. That lesson extends far beyond Mali. As historians widened their research across Africa, they found that menstrual practices varied enormously. There was no single African tradition. In some societies, menstruation attracted very little public attention. In others, it was surrounded by ritual. Some communities encouraged temporary withdrawal from certain activities. Others expected women to continue much as they always had. The diversity is striking. This matters because modern discussions often speak about African traditions as though more than 1,000 cultures shared one identical belief system. They did not. Africa contains extraordinary linguistic, religious, and cultural diversity. The practices of a farming community in Mali cannot automatically be applied to pastoral societies in Kenya, forest communities in Central Africa, or kingdoms along the Atlantic coast. Each developed its own solutions to the challenges of everyday life. One example frequently mentioned alongside the Dogon comes from the historic Kingdom of Benin in present-day Nigeria. Historical descriptions suggest that some households included private areas reserved for women within the family compound. These spaces offered privacy during different stages of life, including childbirth and, in some cases, menstruation. However, historians remain cautious. The surviving evidence does not support the idea that a single standardized system existed across the kingdom. That caution is important. Good history does not fill gaps with certainty. It admits when the evidence is incomplete. Ironically, that honesty often brings us closer to the truth than absolute confidence ever could. As more oral histories were recorded during the 20th century, another pattern slowly emerged. Women themselves often described these customs differently from the outsiders who first documented them. That difference should make every historian pause, because history changes dramatically when the people who actually lived it are finally allowed to speak. Yet if some women remembered these spaces as places of privacy, conversation, and temporary relief, why do so many people today associate menstrual seclusion only with suffering and oppression? The answer lies partly outside Africa. It lies in another part of the world, where menstrual seclusion evolved under very different circumstances, and in some places produced devastating consequences. By failing to separate these very different histories, we accidentally merge them into one story, and that single story continues to shape public understanding today. This is the turning point of the documentary. Instead of choosing sides, we're going to challenge both narratives while keeping the storytelling immersive. The story becomes even more complicated when we leave Africa. For many people today, the phrase menstrual hut immediately brings to mind shocking newspaper headlines. Images of women sleeping alone in freezing sheds, reports of smoke inhalation, snake bites, and preventable deaths. Campaigns demanding the end of dangerous traditions. Those stories are real, but they are not African stories, at least not in the way they are often presented. Most of the reports that dominate international news come from South Asia, particularly Nepal, where the practice known as chowpatty became the focus of global attention. Under this tradition, menstruating women and girls in some communities were expected to stay in small sheds or separate buildings during their periods. The consequences could be devastating. During harsh winters, some women died from exposure to the cold. Others suffocated after lighting fires inside poorly ventilated huts to keep warm. There were reports of snake bites, animal attacks, and serious illness. The risks became so severe that Nepal formally outlawed the practice, although enforcement remains uneven in some rural areas. These tragedies deserve attention. They deserve compassion, and they deserve action. But they also illustrate something historians constantly warn against: the danger of assuming that one practice explains every similar-looking practice everywhere else. Imagine reading about prisons in one country and concluding that every building with locked doors across the world must also be a prison. The conclusion would seem absurd. Yet something remarkably similar has happened with menstrual seclusion. Because the structures sometimes looked alike, people assumed they served the same purpose. History rarely works that way. Across Africa, menstrual customs developed within hundreds of different societies, each shaped by its own environment, beliefs, and social organization. Some practices imposed restrictions that modern observers would rightly criticize. Others created temporary spaces that some women experienced as welcome periods of privacy or relief. Many communities combined elements of both. There was no single African experience. There never has been. This is why historians increasingly avoid broad statements about African menstrual huts. The phrase itself oversimplifies an extraordinary diversity of customs that changed across geography, language, and time. Some traditions limited women's participation in particular rituals or activities during menstruation. Others viewed menstrual blood as carrying spiritual significance that required temporary separation from certain ceremonial spaces. In still other communities, menstruation attracted relatively little formal attention at all. These differences matter because they remind us that culture is never static. It evolves, communities adapt, old customs disappear, new ones emerge. Even within the same ethnic group, practices could differ from one village to another. That complexity rarely survives popular storytelling. Instead, history is squeezed into simple categories: oppressor, victim, sacred, primitive, progressive, backward. The real past almost never fits those labels. It exists in shades of gray. If menstrual seclusion existed only because societies believed women were dangerous or impure, why do so many historical accounts also describe women receiving food, assistance, and relief from demanding physical work? At the same time, if these spaces were purely retreats for rest and sisterhood, why do some oral histories also speak of loneliness, restrictions, or obligations? The answer is uncomfortable. Both experiences could exist. Human societies are capable of compassion and control at the same time. A custom may begin for one reason and continue for another. A practice that once offered protection can later become oppressive if its original purpose is forgotten. History is full of such transformations. Marriage customs, initiation ceremonies, religious rituals, legal systems, even modern institutions evolve in ways their founders never intended. The same is true of traditions surrounding menstruation. What began in one generation as a practical solution could become rigid in another. What one woman remembered as support, another could experience as exclusion. Neither testimony cancels the other. Together, they reveal the complexity of lived experience. This is why modern historians increasingly place women's own voices at the center of the conversation. Oral histories, interviews, and community memories often provide perspectives that early written records overlooked. When those voices are heard alongside archaeology, historical documents, and linguistic evidence, a richer picture begins to emerge. Not a perfect picture, but a more honest one. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this subject has to teach us. History is not a courtroom where every tradition must be declared entirely guilty or completely innocent. It is an investigation, an ongoing search for understanding. The closer we look, the more we discover that simple answers often conceal complicated truths. Which raises another question. If early observers misunderstood practices surrounding menstruation, could they have misunderstood other parts of African life as well? The answer has transformed the way historians study the continent today, because the debate over so-called moon huts is really part of a much larger story, a story about who gets to write history, and whose voices are finally being heard. Who gets to write history? At first, the question sounds philosophical. The most valuable thing about this documentary is not deciding whether the customs of the past were right or wrong. It is learning how to ask better questions. History has a way of tempting us into simple conclusions. We want every tradition to fit neatly into a category: progressive or oppressive, enlightened or primitive, heroic or shameful. Real life is rarely that accommodating. The people who built these communities were neither perfect nor uniquely flawed. They were human beings responding to the realities of their own time. They faced challenges we can still recognize today. How do you care for women's health? How do you balance privacy with participation? How do you preserve cultural identity while adapting to changing knowledge? Different societies answered those questions in different ways. Some answers reflected compassion, others reflected fear. Some customs probably offered comfort to certain women while placing unnecessary burdens on others. That complexity should not disappoint us. It should remind us that history is made by people, not by ideals. Perhaps the greatest mistake we can make is assuming that we already know the whole story before we have heard every voice. For generations, discussions about menstrual seclusion were dominated by outsiders looking in. Missionaries wrote reports, colonial officials filed records, early anthropologists published books. Their work remains an important part of the historical record, but it is only one part. Today, historians increasingly place those records alongside oral traditions, archaeological discoveries, linguistic research, and most importantly, the memories of the communities themselves. The result is not a single new answer. In some places, women remembered these spaces as restrictive. In others, they recalled them as places of privacy, companionship, or temporary relief from demanding daily responsibilities. Neither experience erases the other. Both deserve to be heard. That is why careful history resists easy conclusions. It recognizes that two women living only a few hundred kilometers apart, or even in neighboring villages, could experience similar customs in completely different ways. Culture is never frozen in time. It changes from one generation to the next. It adapts to new beliefs, new environments, and new realities. What existed a century ago may not exist today. What one family practiced may have been rejected by another. This is especially true across Africa, a continent of extraordinary diversity, where thousands of communities developed their own languages, traditions, and ways of understanding the world. To speak of the African way of approaching menstruation is to overlook that remarkable diversity. There has never been a single African story. There have always been many. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden beneath the debate over so-called moon huts. The buildings themselves were never the whole story. The real story has always been about people, about mothers teaching daughters, about grandmothers passing on knowledge that had no textbook, about communities trying, with the understanding available to them, to make sense of one of life's most enduring rhythms. Some practices deserve to remain in the past. Others may still have something to teach us. Wisdom lies in knowing the difference. Today, modern medicine has transformed our understanding of reproductive health. We know more about hormones, fertility, menstrual disorders, and women's health than any previous generation in history. That knowledge has saved lives and continues to improve the quality of life for millions of women around the world. At the same time, scientific progress does not require us to dismiss every tradition that came before it. History and science are not rivals. History tells us how people understood the world. Science helps us test those understandings and build upon them. Together they offer something far more valuable than either could provide alone: a deeper understanding of ourselves. So the next time you hear someone confidently declare that every menstrual hut was a prison, or insist that every one of them was a peaceful sanctuary, remember how rarely history deals in absolutes. The truth is almost always more interesting. It lives in the conversations that were never written down. It survives in the memories of women whose voices were overlooked for generations. And it reminds us that understanding another culture begins not by judging it, but by listening carefully to the people who lived it. Perhaps that is the most important lesson this story has to offer. Not simply that history is complicated, but that curiosity is more powerful than certainty. If this documentary challenged something you thought you already knew, then it has achieved exactly what history is meant to do. It has invited you to look again. If you enjoy exploring Africa's overlooked intellectual history through evidence, careful research, and compelling storytelling, consider subscribing to BTS Africa Media. Every week we uncover stories that have been simplified, misunderstood, or forgotten. And together we separate popular myths from what the historical evidence actually tells us. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Have you encountered similar traditions in your own community or family? Were they remembered as protective, restrictive, or something more complex? Share your perspective in the comments below. The most meaningful history often begins with conversations between people whose experiences are different. I'm the social architect. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep asking difficult questions, keep seeking evidence, and remember that the past is rarely as simple as it first appears. It is far richer, far more human, and far more fascinating than we often imagine. But it has real consequences, because history is rarely shaped only by the people who lived it. More often, it is shaped by the people who wrote it down. For centuries, much of what the outside world knew about Africa came through the journals of explorers, missionaries, colonial officials, and early anthropologists. Many were intelligent, hardworking observers who traveled under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Some spent years documenting languages, recording oral traditions, and preserving cultural practices that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Modern historians owe them a genuine debt. Without many of their notebooks, dictionaries, and maps, entire chapters of African history would have been lost. But even the most careful observer sees the world through the lens of their own experiences. Imagine visiting a country where every wedding ceremony is completely unfamiliar. You might accurately describe the clothing, the music, and the procession. You could measure the dimensions of the building and note every object inside. Yet if you misunderstood the language, failed to grasp the symbolism, or never spoke to the bride and groom, you would still miss the heart of the ceremony. Observation is only the beginning. Understanding comes later. That is why modern ethnography looks very different from the anthropology of the 19th century. Researchers today spend years learning local languages before beginning serious fieldwork. They build relationships within communities. They compare oral histories with archaeological evidence. They revisit earlier accounts instead of accepting them at face value. Most importantly, they recognize that no single source tells the whole story. A missionary's diary reveals one perspective. An elder's memory reveals another. A woman's lived experience may reveal something entirely different. Only by placing these voices side by side does history begin to take shape. This approach has transformed our understanding of many African societies. Practices once dismissed as irrational have been re-examined through new evidence. Agricultural techniques once labeled primitive are now studied for their environmental sustainability. Traditional ecological knowledge is helping scientists understand biodiversity and climate resilience. Ironworking methods once underestimated have revealed remarkable technical sophistication. Again and again, the lesson is the same. Look more closely, ask more questions, resist easy conclusions. The debate surrounding menstrual seclusion belongs within this larger transformation. Instead of asking whether these traditions were simply good or bad, historians now ask different questions. What problems were communities trying to solve? How did these customs function in everyday life? How did women themselves describe their experiences? How did practices change over time? These questions do not produce simple answers. They produce better history. Sometimes the evidence confirms earlier interpretations. Sometimes it overturns them completely. And sometimes it reveals that two seemingly contradictory accounts are both true because they describe different communities, different generations, or different personal experiences. It should encourage us, because real history is rarely tidy. It is filled with contradictions, adaptations, and human choices. New expectations have emerged. Ideas about health, family life, and gender continue to evolve. Now imagine someone trying to describe every workplace on Earth using only one office building. It would be impossible. Some communities emphasized privacy. Others emphasized ritual. Some imposed restrictions that many people today would find unacceptable. Others appear to have developed customs that offered women periods of rest or reduced workloads within the rhythm of daily life. Often, the same tradition contained elements of both care and control. Human societies are rarely consistent. They are complicated because people are complicated. Perhaps that is why debates about so-called moon huts continue today. Not because historians cannot find evidence, but because the evidence reflects real human lives rather than simple ideological stories. The farther we move away from stereotypes, the closer we come to understanding. And perhaps that is the real purpose of studying history. Not to discover heroes and villains, but to discover people. People trying to solve the problems of their own time with the knowledge they possessed. Some succeeded, some failed, most did a little of both. That truth is far more interesting than any myth. Should these traditions be celebrated, condemned, or is there a better way to think about them altogether? That is where our journey ends, and where perhaps the most important lesson